Good evening. End racism, build peace. That's the theme of today's UN International Day of Peace, and it's part of what Pax Christi Scotland says on the tin. So a warm welcome to our speakers and to all of those of you who have joined us to explore what we've entitled The Narrow White Lens, Time for Change. When the physicist Albert Einstein moved to the United States from Germany, he spoke at Lincoln University, the oldest Black college in America, and he told students, using the language of the day, there is separation of colored people from white people in the United States. That separation is not a disease of colored people, it is a disease of white people. I do not intend to be quiet about it. Pax Christi Scotland doesn't intend to be quiet about the narrow white lens through which we teach our children and view our society. It's an issue of marginalization, an issue of peace. It's a challenging issue, but we are not afraid of challenges. I think, however, that we need to pray for guidance. And so may I ask Pax Christi Scotland's chaplain, Father John Convery, to begin our event with reflection and prayer. Father John, over to you.
Thank you, Marion, and a big welcome and a good evening to everybody for taking the time to come along to this gathering and conversation and dialogue this evening. I thought it would probably appropriate to begin our conversation with a reflection from Martin Luther King. When our eyes do not see the gravity of racial justice, shake us from our slumber and open our eyes. When our fear, we are frozen into action, into inaction, give us a spirit of bravery. When we try our best, but say the wrong things, give us a spirit of humility. When the chaos of all this dies down, give us a lasting spirit of solidarity. When it becomes easier to point fingers outwards, help us to examine our own hearts. God of truth, in your wisdom enlighten us. God of hope, in your kindness heal us. Creator of all people, in your generosity guide us. Racism breaks your heart. Break our hearts for what breaks yours. Ever-present God, you called us to be in relationship with one another and promised to dwell wherever 2 or 3 are gathered. In this community, we are many different people. We come from many different places, have many different cultures. Open our hearts, that we may be bold in finding the richness of inclusion and the treasures of diversity among us. And we ask you this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you very much, Father John. And that word solidarity always jumps out. It's one that Pope Francis uses a lot, and I think that it's part of what we're trying to get together this evening, is to be in solidarity with each other. And with your words in mind, may I introduce Nikki Munro. Nikki was born and educated in Dundee and graduated as a teacher in 1993 from St Andrew's College of Education in Bearsden, Glasgow, and it's now the Faculty of Education at Glasgow University. She's worked in both Catholic and non-denominational schools and has taught P1s to P7s. She's been a staff tutor, mentored newly qualified teachers, led staff and inter-school working groups, and has experienced both head teacher and deputy head teacher roles. She's currently deputy head teacher in a large primary school in a suburb of Dundee. Earlier this year, she was part of the first cohort of Education Scotland's Building Racial Literacy programme. And that's a programme to educate educators in the principles of anti-racism in order to tackle racism and racist practices within our establishments. This programme, Nikki says, has fired within her a passion for genuine equality and social justice, and has provided an opportunity for meaningful change. She hopes we can include many perspectives within learning and teaching to ensure a shared understanding of our world and common home, past, present, and future. Nikki, please tell us some more.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for that warm introduction, Marion, and thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. As Marion said, I'm here to talk a little about building racial literacy and the Building Racial Literacy programme, the first of its kind in Scotland. So I will just share my screen so that hopefully everyone can see that there. So to begin with, what is racial literacy? Racial literacy is a concept developed by Black Native American sociologist Frances Widens Twine. And she describes it in her research done in the United Kingdom with mixed race families as a form of racial socialization and anti-racist training that parents of African descent practiced in their efforts to defend their children against racism. And this refers to a set of cultural strategies and practices designed by parents to teach their children, predominantly of African and Caribbean heritage, how to recognise, respond to, and counter forms of everyday racism. So within education, this translates as having the understanding and practice to recognise, respond to, and counter forms of everyday racism or racial microaggression at all levels, personal, cultural, and institutional. In terms of what these things are, everyday and overt racism, we're talking about verbal or physical abuse, deliberately making fun of accents, language, skin colour, clothing, that which ostensibly is recognised as hate crime. And microaggressions are the everyday verbal, non-verbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons solely based upon their marginalised group membership. Examples of that would be making fun of food that people eat, making fun of names, touching headwear, hair, and making a particular culture or heritage out to be less than it is. And finally, the institutional or systemic, and this is where education comes in, is discrimination or unequal treatment on the basis of membership of a particular ethnic group, typically one that is a marginalised or minority group. And it arises from systems, structures, or expectations that have become established within society or an institution. So why is anti-racism needed in 21st century Scotland, and what is it essential to know? As part of the programme, it was important to first understand race and racism in order to support any anti-racist practice. This was accomplished through a series of webinars and presentations by guest speakers. So these 6 points, these 5 points that are on the slide here, it's important to recognise now that racism is a contemporary rather than a historical issue. Racial identity is a social construct, not a biological one. It's important to realise the impact of whiteness. It's important for us to know how to develop language to discuss race and racism. And it's important to know how racial microaggressions operate in everyday school settings. This is because race and racism intersect with other areas of discrimination, such as class, gender, and sexuality, with a descriptor known as intersectionality. So the concept of a racial group comes from certain anthropological theories which have long been disproved. They were mostly developed in the late 19th and early 20th century in Western Europe, and claimed that humans could be divided into racial groups based on physical and behavioural traits linked to ethnicity, linked to nationality, and related concepts like shared language. These theories were influenced by colonialism and imperialism, and there's the desire to show that non-white groups were inferior in order to justify the actions of Western nations. For hundreds of years, white British society has enjoyed a position of economic, social, and political power over non-white people in Britain and across the world through empire and colonialism and their after effects known as coloniality. Although people in Scotland often know little about this history, the social attitudes that developed over this time are still present in our society. This is known as white ideology, or sometimes white supremacy. The advantages that this still brings to white majority ethnic Scottish people are known as white privilege. And the important thing to know about racism is that it is defined and based on outcomes, not individual intentions. So, to the programme. The Building Racial Literacy programme itself. After the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, children and young people met with the Deputy First Minister to speak out and share their lived experiences of racism. The children wanted teachers to think about how to better reflect Black and minority ethnic history and experience, as well as the importance of tackling racism in society today. From this meeting, a race equality and anti-racism in education programme was established, and it focused on 4 particular areas: school leadership and professional learning, curriculum reform, diversity in the teaching profession and education workforce, and racism and racist incidents. In listening to the experiences of the children and young people, and with the guidance of the programme board, Education Scotland worked with partners to create professional learning for Scotland's educators to build the racial literacy. This meant making a learning programme for teachers and practitioners to build their anti-racist skills and increase their awareness of the impact of race on the learners, families, and communities that they support. The programme was designed by partners with a strong influence in education and with a wealth of anti-racist knowledge. The first version of this programme began in January 2022, with the first cohort of educators taking part. And as Marion said, I was part of that first cohort. Over 80 educators from all over Scotland, working in nurseries, schools, universities, local authorities, and third sector organisations, were all learning to be anti-racist. One of the aims of the programme was to make people working in education less race evasive, which means that educators don't avoid talking about race And instead of ignoring racism, they feel confident challenging racism and helping those who experience it. So on the programme, we've been listening to children and young people's experience of race and finding out what they'd like to see us doing differently, learning about our own racial identities and how that might impact our teaching practice day to day, sharing good practice and ideas, and drawing up our own individual action plans. During this course, one white participant stated, "I hadn't imagined some of the experiences of people of colour. I was quite taken aback about how I hadn't considered certain things, such as how a child of colour might feel in a class of white people." As well as this, we realised that this would also include a child of colour not seeing examples of themselves or their history represented in the curriculum. The programme was also an opportunity for teachers who experience racism to connect and find support and know that they are not alone. A practitioner of colour stated, "The most valuable lesson that I have learned so far is that I am not alone. I may be the only person of colour in my school, but I'm part of this huge community of educators who want to make the right change for the young people in our care." So as part of these anti-racist action plans, some of the intentions were to engage with families, develop from a very basic understanding of racism, develop a more inclusive and anti-racist curriculum, start anti-racist clubs, encourage more diversity and anti-racist discussions in meetings, challenge racial slurs and racial microaggressions, and bring anti-racism to the fore when planning and preparing our lessons. And many, many more. We also thought about and discussed what an anti-racist curriculum would look like. So in school already, we talk about an inclusive curriculum, which is an approach that acknowledges the diversity of learners within a learning environment. It would also include removing or at least minimising barriers that hinder participation. An anti-racist curriculum is one that looks for opportunities in curriculum to raise learner awareness of the issues of racism, to offer spaces for discussion on the topic, and it makes links to other forms of societal oppressions. In terms of decolonising the curriculum, this involves a critical analysis of how colonial forms of knowledge, teaching strategies and research methodologies have shaped what we know, what we recognise, and how we reward such knowledge accordingly. So in terms of teachers and in terms of lesson planning, anti-racist teachers need to ask themselves, why have I chosen a particular topic to teach? Is it because it's always been done? Whose perspective is it taught from? Whose perspective is missing? Why is it missing? Who does this impact upon? And how does it link with modern Scotland today? There are many examples on this. I don't have time to share all of those tonight. The Building Racial Literacy programme is only the beginning. It will grow and be offered to more practitioners and teachers, and cohort 2 has now begun, so that anti-racism is a baseline value in Scottish education. Some useful links I can add to this, which I'm sure will be part of the recording, and I can send my slides, are 3 particular areas that I looked at on my journey, and I would like to finish with some quotes. Thanks, Marion.
Thank you so much, Nikki. I think one of the words that came out of that for me was about perspective and what perspective we're looking at people from and how we're doing things. I'm reminded of the author, Nigerian-born author Chimamanda Adichie, who said in a TED talk that the only books that she saw when she was a child were books that had, they were like the famous five, they were white children. And so, that made it very difficult for her to have something to identify with. So thank you for that insight into the narrow white lens that we still apply. And I'm sure that we're all encouraged by what you've shared there. So reminding everybody to put your questions to Nikki and all of our speakers in the chat. Could I now introduce Margaret-Ann Fisken? I'm most grateful to Margaret-Ann for accepting our invitation. She's a very busy lady. She's a barrister at law. She's also trained as an intercultural communication consultant and is an accredited mediator. Margaret-Ann served as chair of the Catholic Association for Racial Justice from 2002 to 2011, and as moderator of the Racial Justice Network of Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. And she's also served for 10 years as a member of the Caritas Europa Migration Commission. She now works as a racial justice consultant to business, charitable organisations and schools throughout the UK. I hope we'll hear about her experiences with the Catholic Association for Racial Justice and her work in intercultural competence, and how does she think we can change that narrow white lens. Margaret-Ann, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marion. I think you might be disappointed, but as Marion said, I am a barrister, but I'm not going to speak to you this evening as a barrister, because those of you who've had any dealings with barristers know that it's almost impossible to perform as a barrister in a 10-minute slot. We have a lot to say and we take time to do our performances. And yes, I am an intercultural trainer, and part of what I do, both for CAJ and independently, is to teach people how to communicate effectively across cultures, and how to think and act appropriately, and how to work with people from different cultural backgrounds. And I work to support schools on their anti-racism journeys. So what Nikki had to say about the Building Literacy program, racial literacy program, and its efforts to empower educators in leading anti-racist change really resonated with me. And I congratulate that initiative, and I congratulate you, Nikki. But I don't want to speak to you as an interculturalist either. Instead, I'd like to speak to you as a dreamer. And this is why I say Marion might be disappointed. I'd like to invite you, as Pope Francis does in Fratelli Tutti, to dream as a single human family. And Fratelli Tutti is a document that I love and I've read and reread. And the one phrase that I love above all the others is a single human family. And when we think about it from a genealogical perspective, it shouldn't be that difficult to achieve. Because in terms of our DNA, we're 99.7% the same. All 7.8 billion of us are human cousins. And this fundamental sameness that we all share coexists without differences, both visible and non-visible. And I believe that in order to acknowledge our sameness, while recognizing and celebrating our differences, love, a love, as Pope Francis puts it, that transcends the barriers of geography and distance, has to be at the center of everything that we do. And here's the problem. Everything that comprises racism was built on a foundation that's the opposite of love. So how do we sow the seeds of peace and live, again, quoting Pope Francis, in a fraternal openness that allows us to acknowledge, appreciate, and love each person? How do we widen or broaden or somehow expand the narrow white lens? Some of you may have heard of Chine MacDonald, who is a Nigerian woman married to an Irish man, but carries a Scottish name, MacDonald, who is a regular contributor to BBC religious programming. And she's the author of a wonderful book called God is Not a White Man. And in that book, she writes, prejudices exist in all societies and cultures, but the racism that exists in majority white cultures, whether it is pervasive, subtle, or explicit, comes from the mistaken idea that whiteness is inherently good and in fact closest to godliness, and anything that is not white is less intelligent, less beautiful, and less worthy of freedom and power. So how do we deconstruct these ideas that are so embedded in our cultures, especially majority white cultures? And I believe that that journey has to begin with ourselves. We have to begin by looking inward. Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti, citing the parable of the Good Samaritan, refers to the interior struggle that each of us experiences as we gradually come to know ourselves through our relationships with our brothers and sisters. And it is an interior struggle. We have to look at the parts of ourselves that aren't pretty, that we hide or pretend aren't there. We have to look at our own implicit biases and the toxic effect that these can have on others, and although less obviously, on ourselves as well. A good starting point, I think, is if you're white, to ask yourself, if I woke up Black tomorrow, how would my world be different? And vice versa. Would I be happy with these differences? It's food for thought. When Pope Francis wrote Fratelli Tutti in 2020, the world had come to a standstill with COVID-19. George Floyd had been murdered in the US, and Black Lives Matter had become an international movement. It was a time of seismic change. We all tried to familiarize ourselves with new terminology, words like allyship, white privilege, microaggression, which Nikki has talked about, and so on. There was collective anti-racist action on an unprecedented scale. Why? Why did the world react as it did to the murder of George Floyd? It was a time that certainly felt very different to those of us who've been involved in racial justice work for a very long time. It felt as though people were finally paying attention. Was it because everything was quieter due to the pandemic, less distractions, the volume turned down on life generally? I can tell you, Kaj received countless invitations to speak to Catholic and non-Catholic organizations and schools about anti-racism. We were invited to train seminarians in developing an anti-racism mindset. And we dared to hope that this time it was a movement and not a moment, as Keir Starmer was heavily criticized for saying that it was a moment in time. So what has happened in the intervening 2 years? Was this the turning point we had been praying for so many years? Was this the opportunity to broaden the narrow white lens? Sadly, I don't think so. And I'm going to give you just a couple of reasons, examples of things that have happened since, subtle things. So when the new season of the Premier League kicked off a couple months ago, it was announced that players would no longer be taking the knee in solidarity with Black Lives Matter before every game. There has been a 23% drop in Black characters in children's bestsellers since 2020. And in July, the UK's first journalism prize for Black reporters, which was only launched in July 2020, was scrapped. These are only a few examples of what can be seen as potentially backward steps. But racism hasn't gone away. Pope Francis, as usual, summed it up succinctly when he denounced racism, likening it to a virus that lurks in waiting, only to emerge and show that our supposed social progress is not as real or definitive as people think. And as UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres has said, racism continues to poison institutions, social structures, and everyday life in every society. It continues to be a driver of persistent inequality, and it continues to deny people their fundamental human rights. So how do we re-energize people and regain the momentum that we had in 2020? How do we keep racial justice issues from falling off the agenda? How do we expand the narrow white lens? Sadly, I don't have an answer. And to be honest, I don't think there is a single answer. But I do know that we have to act. We have to take action every day. We have to show up and speak out. We have to keep pushing for change now and in the future. Being anti-racist has to be a lifelong commitment, because only in that way will the dream that Pope Francis invited us to share ever become a reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret-Ann. And I can assure you I'm far from disappointed. And I hope that we can join you in that dream as a single human family in our attempt to meet the challenges of racism. You've given us much food for thought, and I hope that we'll take that away with us and try to make it that lifelong challenge to take that forward. So with all of that in mind, I would now like to introduce Graham Campbell. I've known Graham for many years, each of us wearing many different hats. I must call him Councillor Graham Campbell today. Graham was elected as Glasgow's first African Caribbean City Councillor in 2017. In May of this year, he was appointed chair of the Education Skills and Early Years City Policy Committee, the main scrutiny committee for Glasgow Education Service. He has already worked with teachers to upgrade the modern studies school curriculum to include slavery legacy modules and to diversify the teacher workforce. He's been working in this field since 2020, when he was appointed chair of the Slavery Legacy Working Group, a Glasgow City Council committee responsible for starting a public discussion and consultation on street names, statues, and built heritage, hearing from expert historians and from African community representatives on how enslaved African labour was the foundation of the transatlantic tobacco, sugar, and cotton trades that made Glasgow wealthy. This work culminated in Dr. Stephen Mullen's report into Glasgow City Council's financial links to slavery, which resulted in the full council meeting unanimously issuing a formal apology for the slavery legacy in April 2022. I first knew Graham as a musician and cultural producer and have followed his campaigns in African and Caribbean communities for reparative justice and for recognition by the city of Glasgow of its slavery legacy. He's spoken at several debates and seminars and appeared in TV documentaries on the slavery legacy, and is the council's representative on the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, the Scottish strategic racial equality charity. There's so much more that I could say, but I think you've got a good idea now that this man is an ideal speaker for this event that we're having tonight on this UN International Day of Peace. So, Graham, over to you.
Thank you for that lengthy biography, which I probably was responsible for half writing, so apologies for that, but you don't know where to stop to get it all in. But what I suppose I will try to do is really just try and add to what has been already presented by my two illustrious colleagues, Nikki and Margaret-Ann. And thank you so much, Nikki, because of what you have written, you've made it unnecessary for me to cover a lot of that ground. But it's safe to say that there is a national strategy now in Scotland, and particularly in education authorities, to do something about tackling diversity in the curriculum itself, but also in basically dealing with what's inside our heads when we're in the schools. I suppose I should start by really beginning with where this question of racial literacy comes from. Now, if you're an American politician just now, and particularly if you're the governor of Virginia, who won his election based on fighting critical race theory Marxism in school, brainwashing our kids in our schools, what they mean is being taught to be anti-racist is somehow revolutionary Marxist. Now, given the number of socialist teachers I know, who I've known throughout my lives, in fact, for the last 30 years, I think you could safely say that teacher trade unions have been dominated by socialistically minded people. If they were so successful at brainwashing everybody, then that would be reflected surely in our politics. And the fact is, I think that capitalist society seems to be reproducing itself rather too well for that to be true. And one of those reproductions, of course, is systematic and systemic racism. Of course, we have to have a discussion about what we think racism is, and if you ask different social theorists, you'll get a different answer. But I'll start with Milagros Phillips, who I think is probably the best known sort of synthesizer of the concept of racial literacy. She says that she defines it as this. She said that she came up with this definition herself because in the writings that she had, and by the way, if you don't know her, she is from the Dominican Republic originally and is an African-American scholar. She says that racial literacy is the knowledge and awareness of the history of race, how one is acculturated into a racial caste, so racial caste, the systems within the nation state that support race as a human circle, and the impact of all of the above on current politics and individual lives. I'm slightly paraphrasing, but current events and individual lives, so current politics, obviously. So these are the things. Racial literacy is necessary because no decision in any circumstances in a society that has a history that ours has, and ours, and I'm talking about Scotland here, as part of the British Empire, has as a colonial empire based upon the wealth extracted from enslaved Africans through chattel slavery. The fact that the origins of our racism come from that, and that they are reflected into the institutions that we have built, the educational structures, indeed the very bricks and buildings that we're all broadcasting from, probably. When we are aware that that system still lives within the current politics and current events, for example, as a taxpayer, any of you who've been paying taxes in the UK up until 2015, you may not have been aware that you've been paying off the long-term British government debt that was basically borrowed to pay back for the compensation of slave owners. You remember that slavery was abolished in 1838. What you may not be aware of is that the 5 years before that, there was an apprenticeship system which enslaved Africans paid for it in their own blood for 5 years. And then these owners were bailed out by a massive government loan. And you stopped paying that only in 2015. So anybody who tells you this is way past, you have been still paying the compensation for enslaved African people's loss, their gain of their freedom, the losses to the people who enslaved them. And of course, the families who still live in those houses and country estates and have the accumulated wealth, the institutions like Glasgow University that have been endowed by those people are still here. So what do we do with that legacy? So part of that, the necessity for the racial literacy is in fact the correct knowledge of our history, therefore the correct knowledge of who belongs, and that of course everybody belongs and everybody has made their contribution, but the awareness that there is a problem with racism in Scotland, that white racial supremacy is ingrained within the decision-making processes of organizations, institutions, the very language we use, the descriptors that we use, the term of black indeed, and contested how it's used negatively throughout our language. So all these questions are therefore necessary to A, expose that racism is a problem, B, to have a way of talking about it, and C, a way to challenge the negative impact of it. Because the obvious points are that why would people be racist? There's no logic to it because we know that biologically it's not a real concept. Biologically race is nonsense, but sociologically it has real power and real value. And the only possible explanation I've always come up with is that people wouldn't discriminate unless they felt they benefited from discrimination. In other words, this concept of white privilege, there's no logical rhyme or reason for people to discriminate unless they believe, wrongly usually, that they could benefit from that discrimination. And the question then is, how does those benefits accrue? And you see this through the statistics. The statistics prove it because you see racial disparity in incomes, racial disparity in the way public services delivered, racial disparity on exclusions from school in England. We see that a lot, not so much in the Scottish context. It's a slightly different context for us, but still we see disparity in the outcomes of people's lives, people's underemployment, despite African, Caribbean and Asian and Chinese kids doing very well in our schools in Glasgow. We have slightly different experiences to say a school in a similar school setting in similar sized cities. So if you compared us with Manchester has a different problem of exclusion and underperformance of African and Caribbean students, whereas we have African Caribbean students actually usually outperforming white children. That's been a phenomenon we've had for 20 years. But what happens when they leave school? They're not getting jobs to the educational level they're requiring. They're not getting access to organizations like the council. So there are things that we've had to look at as an institution, as a council, to say, well, what are we doing wrong? What is it that we are doing that's making these discriminatory outcomes arise? And obviously we go back to the Macpherson definition, which slightly referred to in Nikki's talk there, that the Macpherson definition talks about procedures, processes, behaviors and attitudes. That's what the law says in Scotland. Some of the best anti-racism law on the planet. The problem is that 22 years on, we're not properly implementing them. Institutions are not being challenged enough to actually be measured and impacted upon about how they change things. One of the good things about the Teaching in a Diverse Scotland report that came out in 2021, about half of the evidence from that actually came from Glasgow schools. So we made quite a contribution to that. And it concluded some obvious points that yes, there is institutionalized discrimination, that Black teachers face barriers getting into the profession, staying in the profession, and getting career progression through the organization of education. The other factor, of course, is what is taught. That the curriculum, one of the main demands from the Black Lives Matter movement, which was part, was to change what is taught. And the fact that you're now getting a more accurate history. Maybe 20 years ago when I first came to Glasgow, there really wasn't that many Scottish-based scholars doing that kind of work on the history of the country, the correct history of the country, I would say, that recognized the political settlement we've got has a link to enslavement and empire. and the constitutional position that we have is directly related to that legacy. And if we don't talk about it, then we have a danger of having two mythical narratives surfacing about what the country is and what our identity is and who we are as a people. The two mythical narratives I always talk about are the sort of mythical Scottish one, which says, oh, we're a poor wee country that was oppressed by the English, we're a colony, and we had nothing to do with that empire slavery business, and nothing to do with Glasgow, that's the English. The other mythical narrative we have is United Kingdom version of that, which is we abolished slavery and we were so brilliant at abolishing slavery for Africa and the Caribbean, neatly forgetting the 200 years where Britain was the prime perpetrator of slavery in the Atlantic. So the denialism, and therefore the organized forgetting, which Glasgow has been grappling with and trying to reverse that organized forgetting, important place for that to be reversed is within education. So we've made a very strong effort to translate some of the lessons of that Black Lives Matter moment into institutional change. We started to sort of have that conversation, as Mariam said in the introduction, with the citizens who, my gratefulness about this is that the citizens, for the most part, have responded very positively to the questioning of that legacy and to say, well, actually, we're not rejecting it. We want to know why we didn't know. We're horrified and we're shocked, but why didn't we know? Why didn't somebody tell us in education when I was learning history in my school in the 70s, 80s, or 90s? Why didn't I know about this? That's a good response. People are saying, okay, they're open to listening and to knowing more about the so-called merchant city in Glasgow. Where do those merchants make their money from? The cotton, the tobacco, the sugar. That's good. But the next thing is, what about the names of those streets? What about those statues? What about those place names, those institutions? What about the legacies that have come to Glasgow University? So they had a similar process. We helped them begin in 2015. It culminated in 2018 in a report by Dr. Mullen and Professor Newman, which concluded that just for the building of the main Glasgow University building, the equivalent of £200 million worth of donations were taken from just 23 wealthy families in the west of Scotland who made their money in some way through slavery. And that's a quite substantial amount of money, just the building of one building, not even talking about all the bequests and so on. So the fact that you could see there's documented evidence now of that link from the wealth to the exploitation to the development of the racism and therefore to the inequality, that was important that we proved that. We also proved the linkage between Scotland and the Caribbean, Scotland as a perpetrator in that process, and that process led to Glasgow making a reparative gesture in terms of making a link with the University of the West Indies and establishing a centre for the study of Caribbean slavery between the two universities. So these are the two linkages we've made in the sort of the university level and the city level, and then now through our education process. And I'm going to sort of conclude by looking at the process that we have within the council. It relates very much to what Nikki said in the first slides, that we've had to adopt an approach called systematic change in leadership of race equality. So Glasgow's approach, I will read just directly from the document because I think it's important to do it. Our approach in education services is progressing with systemic change in leadership of race equality, which is fundamentally aimed to challenge and eradicate institutional racism. That's the first thing. We recognize that we are an institutionally racist organization. Lord William McPherson defined institutionalized racism in his 1999 report as the collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people. He said that it could be seen in processes, attitudes, and behavior which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping which disadvantage minority ethnic people. Now, as a result of, I'm paraphrasing here, but obviously that term unwitting prejudice is very controversial now because it's led to schools of thinking like unconscious bias training. And while that has a role, a lot of Black activists in particular are annoyed with that because most prejudice is very not unwitting. But let's caveat that and say that the processes and behaviors of an institution don't depend on an individual being racist. It's the structure and the cultural mores and the norms that that organization has set, which exclude other people. And that's what we're all having to grapple with. So education services are continuing to develop progressive approaches in many areas, including organizational and individual capacity, staff training on race equality and associated responsibilities, recording and reporting and handling of racist incidents, and diversity across our estate in all areas. That means in all categories of workforce, recruitment, retention, and progression of staff, and ensuring that our curriculum is fit for 21st century Scotland. Whilst we've made progress in some areas, we undoubtedly have much more to do. The evidence and continuing impact of institutional racism is clear. Absolute commitment, direction, and actions from our leaders across all our sectors for real change and positive impact are crucial. And Samir Sharma, our qualities lead, wrote that in March 2021. And he sort of ends his comments by saying this: often it can feel like we end up in planning battles. I would suggest our focus should be on battling the plan. In my view, the way to do that is to nurture and to implement an approach of systemic change in leadership of race equality, which is indeed appropriate for all protected characteristics. For us, for all of us as leaders, resilience and determination are vital. Let's do the right thing. Let's be valiant. Let's look at ourselves first and progress positively together. And that's me.
Graham, thank you. More challenges, more and more challenges. But thank you so much for that. Now, I know that people are hoping to have their say, and I'm going to hand over now to Callum for our question and answer session. So I do hope that people will put their questions into the chat. I've cheated and put one in myself, and Callum, feel free to use it or otherwise. Callum.
Well, in that case, Marianne, why don't I ask you just to start off while I bring everybody onto screen? Why don't you start off with your question that you've got there, just to get things going? And while you're doing that, everybody can share their questions in the chat, and that would be fantastic.
Well, I'm wondering what the reaction is to all of these attempts that each of our three speakers has spoken about. What is the reaction to the attempts to change this narrow white lens? How do parents react? How does the public react? How do the public respond when they're asked to make these, what for some people will be quite momentous changes in their way of thinking? I'd love to hear what each of you has to say about that.
So why don't we come to Margaret-Ann first of all?
Okay. I know that when we do, and my question relates to this because I don't know to what extent this impacts in Scotland, but you know, in October 2020, Kemi Badenoch, who was the Equalities Minister at that time, spoke in the House of Commons and said that it is illegal to teach critical race theory in schools without presenting an alternative viewpoint, and that terms like white privilege and other terms are, she didn't use the word triggering, but they should be avoided. And I know when we go into schools as CAJ, Catholic schools trust us because they know us, but they are nervous. And a lot of the parents are nervous about the language that we use and about you know, teaching their children that these things are going to be divisive rather than cohesive. And it's a reaction that's based upon what is being said by politicians. And we try and do training for teachers, parents, and children so that everybody's sort of getting the benefit. But it is concerning to me that people are actually nervous to hear these things, because a lot of them are convinced that to talk about race is divisive, and that if you can adopt a colorblind approach, it's more healing, it's more it's a better way forward. And we know that it isn't, but it's concerning to me.
Nikki, then perhaps specifically in a school context, what
Yes.
sort of response do you see from parents?
What I would say to that question is, rather than it being about different people that have a vested interest in school, I would say the objection that you would get from this would be, it would be colour related as well. It would be from the white perspective, as opposed to, I wouldn't really distinguish between parents or staff. I would say it's something that's known as white fragility. And, you know, and actually having come through this course, you know, I've had to explore my own implicit bias. I've had to explore my own privilege. I've had to explore and own my own white fragility in becoming defensive when things are said, because as a white person, you don't have to acknowledge or see yourself as having a racial frame, because that's the way kind of racism works. So what I have been doing in school is as I've been going through the first cohort of the Building Racial Literacy programme, I've made use of staff meetings and in service days to present a lot of what I've been learning to staff. And it was having a few staff on, our staff is predominantly white, and we have one person of colour who is on supply with us. And due to her, and it was actually a Czech teacher and a teacher from a travelling family, through them talking about their own lived experiences in terms of, you know, what they'd experienced being involved in education, it opened up a bit of discussion, and I think staff have been receptive to it. Parents, what meant the next steps in school would be to do a presentation, you know, similar to this. I think the key to this is understanding why. It's not about anybody being threatened. It's about not just telling a single story or part of a story. It's about the whole story, and that, you know, that people of colour's experiences, lived experiences, history has almost been whitewashed, you know, out of the curriculum. And therefore we're not telling the story of the whole human race. We're telling part of it that's been kind of put in there through colonialism, through the empire, because this is the narrative we want people to know. We need to break that down. And it would be done again, you know, with parents. I would envisage the same way as staff, in terms of looking at, you know, curricular areas. You know, there's a P2, that's 6-year-olds, they do a topic called Farm to Fork. And initially it's farms in Scotland, farms in Britain. So one of the ways we would look to explore that is, what about cocoa farmers, coffee farmers? What about the climate crisis that's affecting people in developing countries who are farming? That is so different to farm. So it's exploring and expanding that lens. And as Margaret referred to there about not talking, you know, looking at colour blindness. If there was the Channel 4 documentary that I watched was, if we have a colourblind approach, we are ignoring the lived experience of people of colour for centuries, and that's not okay. So I think it's a balance, Callum, of supporting people's understanding as to why, and then saying what we're going to do, but giving the why kind of before the how.
Thanks, Nikki. That's incredibly powerful. And then Graham, if I can bring your thoughts in as well and maybe tie the two questions together, because I know that
they do tie together.
Certainly, and I know that in your role as a counsellor, you know, you'll have that public-facing element, certainly. So, you know, that element of how does the public respond to these matters, but also with your more kind of overarching political role, this notion of how decisions made at Westminster impact here in Scotland. So if I could ask you just to bring those together.
Well, from the council chamber, the fact, I think we were actually in the full council session that the day she made that statement. There was much mirth and ridicule of that such a ridiculous thing could be said. For a start, we have a barrister with us, and if you obviously as a barrister, maybe you know this, but actually critical race theory, the terminology comes from people who were in law schools, African-American lawyers in law schools in the late 1980s, who came up with a theory about how to look at institutional bias in the criminal justice system. Now, of course, no school child in any part of the planet is going to be taught critical race theories, because they would have to be university educated law students to be in the position to do so. But the fact that the Virginia governor won his election based on opposition to critical race theories was a big cultural war thing at the time Kemi Badenoch made that statement. And of course, Kemi Badenoch, as a privileged upper class multi-millionairess, has been insulated from the impact of institutionalized racism by her class, and therefore she of course has no sympathy whatsoever with Black working class people. I don't expect her to. Some people feel that maybe feel betrayed by her stance. Well, you know, there's always been Black rich people who support the system that discriminates against the majority of us. There always have been, there always will be, and she's a spokesperson for white racist power structure, and that's what she is. She's a white racist. And that's what you'd expect them to say, that, you know, the anti-racism is an agenda of Paulo Freire trying to brainwash teachers into brainwashing students into cultural Marxism for anti-capitalistic purposes. Well, in my case, I plead guilty to that, but I don't think that's true of everybody else, you know, because I think we're having modularly minimal success in that project. So clearly this is nonsense, but it's a defense mechanism against the entrenched privileged power structures that woman defends and wanted to be prime minister in order to defend. So of course she will not acknowledge the slavery legacy still has an impact. Even the social science proves it. Going back to the question that was raised here from, I think it was Marion, wasn't it, that the white lens and how the public and the parents respond. My experience has been that the public responds very well to historical discussions that seem to be distant. Remember that Scotland's a country that sees itself in a very social democratic, solidaritarian, civic-minded and progressive self-identification. It's very different from the citizens of 100 and 200 years ago. They would have seen themselves as part of an empire and seen themselves very differently. Scots see themselves as enlightened people, and therefore are kind of almost horrified and offended by being seen in this way. So countering that and having an anti-slavery and abolition history is important to Scots for their own self-worth as a nation. But so I think that it's definitely the case that they respond well to those kind of historical discussions. What they do not seem to be much more defensive about, in my experience, has been the idea that something you do right now can have discriminatory consequences, and that you can be a perpetrator now of discrimination. People find that hard to accept. And until fairly recently, there was a denialism about us having a racism problem. Indeed, some education authorities would say, oh, we don't have any Black students, so we don't have a problem with racism. That was said, I've heard it said. Thankfully, not recently, but you know, it's now they would be laughed off the stage if they was to say such a thing now. But then the question that comes is that if you have very few people of color in your education system, does that not obligate you then still to do all the anti-racist legwork that you need to do to be a non-racist environment for those people to be comfortable in? I have to say that I experience microaggressions all the time, and it's only when I introduce myself as counselor that seems to insulate me from that impact. I went to an event just last night, and the person at the door, well-meaning, but he thought I was a member of the public. So, you know, I said, and I had to explain several times, I'm actually an invited guest of the owner of this establishment. And I then was allowed to go downstairs, but I was held at the gate as if, you know, and it still affects me. You know, microaggressions affect me all the time. And if I'm getting that and I'm the person who's nominally got some political stake within the system, that tells you just how deeply ingrained those attitudes are. And it's not just coming from white people. I have to say it's coming from other non-white people too. And my casework tells me that you know, Asian people, Arab people, everybody else seem to think, well, at least judging by the evidence casework, that they're not quite as low down the pecking order of racism as black people are. And they may be wrong about that, but that there is that perception that at least we're not as down and graded as they are. So there is still a problem within and between cultures. And I do think that therefore the way that parents react is going to be much more important in schools. I'm very of the view that it's not just sufficient for teachers to report racist incidents and for it to be monitored at our end, you know, looking at the reports that come to committee. I actually think that it's good that we have anti-racism clubs, many of our schools do, but I would like to see the parents more engaged and more involved in creating the school community and actually receiving the same training that the teachers are now receiving. I'm very positive and pleased that the last couple of years, over 500 school leaders in Glasgow have received this racial literacy training, and obviously more of them will get it. But I'd like to see parents and parent councils get that too, because it strikes me that when a child is doing a racial incident after school and we report it, the whole mechanism is designed for not to excluding kids from school. We want to keep those in, but educate them. I have to say, I think we should do much more to bring their parents in, because these attitudes often come from their parents, but they're coming from the wider culture. We can't ignore the fact that the whole culture is involved in that. So to wind up without doing another thing, I think that the impact on Scottish education of CRT is very minimal, but I think that the commitment of a large number of educators out there to an anti-racist, an actively anti-racist education system is there. And I think one of the ways we do that is by not just by talking about slavery, we actually talk about how the wider curriculum, you know, maths involves Arab and African and Asian cultures. You know, the numeral system is Indian, not just Arabic, it's Indian. So the origins of where our science and maths comes from can be integrated into the wider curriculum and give people another impression. Primary school kids in Albert Primary School in Glasgow, actually, because they couldn't see children's books with their faces in them and stories about them, they wrote their own. And they've done a brilliant job at filling a library full of books which have Asian, African and Chinese children and girls in particular at the forefront of the subject in the story. And seeing books that see them so you can be them is crucial to the positive development of children in our system.
So much to consider there, Graham, so much. And I have a feeling that we could honestly continue our conversation all night. I am going to try and take another couple of questions that we'll try and move through as quickly as we can, because I want to try and get as many of these questions in as we can. The first one is kind of reflecting on recent events, and I'm sure we've all seen the news from Leicester and Birmingham, and the question is around the role of religious hatred and how that links with our discussions around racial justice and racial literacy, acknowledging that religious power was a fundamental part of slavery and colonialism. So if we could get perhaps a comment on that, and then alongside that, maybe some reflections from yourselves on how we can listen and how we can learn, and the context for that is perhaps how bruising and damaging social media can be. So this notion of religious power running alongside our discussion this evening, and then how can we listen and learn? And I'll start with Nikki this time and work around from there.
Okay. I think it's very similar. There's a similar theme going through this, that we need to be comfortable in our own skin, and we need to not be defensive, and appreciate that on a global perspective, there are many religious traditions that we need to respect and appreciate that people have grown up with. Just like if someone were to challenge any of our religious persuasions, you know, we have to respect. And I think Pope Francis, you know, I know he's been referred to so much tonight too. I think all his writings, he sums up all of this beautifully, and he would be the go-to person for me in terms of all of this. But it's about having a shared understanding of where each of us is coming from and respecting the other person's viewpoint without it coming to conflict. You know, it's you know, if we're not, it's about living and let live. So yeah, I don't understand why we fight about these things. We need to be comfortable and confident in the beliefs that we have, and surely all faiths, the ones that I am aware of anyway, have a foundation of love. And if we're not showing that towards others, then we maybe need to question where our own beliefs sit. That's certainly what I would say on that.
Thank you, Nikki. Graham? You should see the option to unmute there, Graham.
John's question is obviously really prescient at this moment, but I have to say that I don't believe that what you're dealing here is with religious hatred. I think it's political, politicized, polemicized, far-right fascist racism using religion as its cloak. And that's what you're dealing with the Hindu extremists on the one side, who've been behind some of that, the masked men that you saw. They were Hindu nationalists of the BJP, RSS variety. If you don't know who they are, RSS is the Raj Siva Sena, and they are basically a far-right Aryan nationalist racist grouping that wants to defend caste society in India. They're one of the core elements behind the BJP, which is the governing party of India. So unfortunately, Hindutva, the idea that their culture, nation, and their religion are one and the same thing, despite the obvious history of India as a very multi-ethnic, multicultural place, that falsified, politicized history uses religion as its cloak. We know what, you know, we've had that debate in Europe, isn't it, about way European Christian religions mythologize their history and misuse and distort religious values and principles to serve their purposes. You know, right now, Vladimir Putin's favorite churchman is the patriarch of the Orthodox Church, who says that Ukraine doesn't exist, despite, you know, the obvious overwhelming evidence to the contrary. So religion is misused, and religion is misused because we are organized structures which maintain and continue the practice and values of a belief system. And the trick is to recognize that racism and discrimination and violent thoughts and reactions can enter our structures. And it's only by having an ideological and spiritual awareness that our structures are humanly created, therefore they're imperfect, therefore they need to be closely examined and monitored and challenged and changed constantly to avoid this kind of distortion being made of them.
Definitely powerful. Again, thank you, Graham. And again, that point from Nikki around Pope Francis as well. So lots again to ponder. Margaret-Ann, a final word on these couple of questions, if you want.
I think I have nothing to add. I think I would only repeat what the others have already said. So please move on.
I don't believe it, a barrister with nothing to add.
I'm doing my best.
Well, Margaret-Ann, I'll start with you for the next one. Fair is fair. The next one comes from Rosalind, and Rosalind talks about having worked in the NHS and observed prejudice of all sorts. She says, I read books myself that challenged my own whiteness and prejudices. But when I then talk to many people about different perspectives on our history, whether about slavery or colonialism, I meet a lot of resistance. So on that, can you perhaps give some suggestions of reading that might help, that are not too academic perhaps, but for be it parents to support children, or those of us tonight to be able to take that conversation, that argument out into our own lives?
I think there. I think you have to meet people where they are. So, and I personally feel you have to practice compassionate conversations, because I don't think we get anywhere if I think we alienate people. And I think that June's message is indicative of that, you know, too many people opt out of having the conversations because people can be quite abusive and people can be the discussions become very polarized and we get nowhere. In terms of reading matter, I mean, I'm sure Graham will have things that are more specifically linked to both Graham and Nikki to Scotland, but I think, and these are the book I mentioned, the Chinne MacDonald, God is Not a White Man. She's an evangelical person, but she speaks about the church generally, talking about Christian churches in her books. And I think something like, as a primer for everybody, is White Fragility. I think that is really, and How to Be Anti-Racist. White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo and How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, I think are really basic readings for everybody. I could give you a very long list, but I think those are really a good starting point.
Absolutely, and it's great to have a solid starting point. Nikki.
Yeah, well, I'd absolutely agree with what Margaret-Ann had said about the discussions and how to approach those. But in terms of reading, there is a professor in Scotland. She was the first minority ethnic head of school of education at Edinburgh University, and that's Rowena Arshad. And she has written amazing things. She talked what Graham was talking about earlier, about Scottish people thinking, you know, we're all Jock Tamson's bairns and there's no racism here, but it's this systemic stuff that we're almost, without realizing it, we're complicit in things that are going on. We maintain the status quo without realizing it until we start to unpick where this is all coming from. So Rowena Arshad has a number of papers as well as books that she's written about anti-racism, and in particular in education, but it might be helpful for parents, for children. I would also advocate, as Margaret-Ann did, Robin DiAngelo. Pragya Agarwal is another writer who is a very easy read. Now I've got a book, it's in my bag, it's a book that's I think it's actually sitting on my desk in school, and it's I Wish We Knew What to Say. I'm sure that's the title of it. And it's about when children ask us race-related questions. But if you look up Pragya Agarwal, she is an amazing writer. And Bonnie Greer actually has a book on Audible at the moment about Black history. And that is an amazing listen as well. I would add those to the list.
Fantastic, Nikki, thank you. And then for the final word, before I hand back to Marion, Graham.
I was going to say Rennie Edo Lodge is why I'm not no longer talking back to white people about race, but you know, but that's a bit too cynical for this. We want to be positive and optimistic. So I put in a little comment for David Osuga's primer book, the shorter book. You know about his book Black and British and the series he did, but actually there's a children's version of that which actually is a bit more accessible and illustrated. And I actually think the way he lays that out is very good, because it's a good way into the subject to discuss it with children. I think that's important to do. Personally, I generally would go to websites. There's a group called the Anti-Racist Education Scotland. They have a website which has good glossaries of all the terminologies and definitions, everything you can think of, every kind of, from microaggression, Islamophobia. It details some very good researched definitions. So I'd recommend going to them. I'll try and find it and put it in the chat. But personally, I've seen in my lifetime, as an adult, I've seen 3 waves of racism and anti-racism in terms of movements go, and I'm currently in my 3rd one. And what I receive racism, it's a constantly moving target of references and complexities, and it's almost like the nuclear arms race. You have measures and countermeasures, and and it's kind of similar in the debate about racism and how it moves itself. But I found that the work of Balava Sivanandan, or A. Sivanandan, as he's called, he's from the Institute of Race Relations, and they produce a scholarly journal called Race and Class, and that journal has been writing from a left perspective about race for over 50 years. And he came up with the concept of xeno-racism to describe the combination of xenophobia and racism, the racializing processes that people go through. So I recommend anything that he's written, but particularly the stuff on xeno-racism, which I think explains a lot about the anti-migrant racism that you see now and Islamophobia. There's other one was in my head this day and it's just disappeared because I'm talking too much, but if I remember it, I will put it in the chat.
Fantastic. And I know that Marion will be happy to share some of this by email as well. So don't feel as if you're needing to sit and scribble all of this furiously from the chat. I know that that will go out too. Thank you very much to all three of you for a wonderful conversation tonight, for being with us. But to say more, I will hand over now to Marion.
Well, lots of stuff for us to ponder, lots of books for us to read. There are a number of books there. I've actually clicked on them and I've got them on my, I've got them there. I'll try and give them to everybody. But whew, wow. So many challenges. First of all, thank you to Callum for helping everybody to have their say. I'm sure there are more things that people are now trying to say, and I wish we had the time to do it. Thank you so much to Nikki, to Margaret-Ann, and to Graham for the very, very challenging insights. And thank you all for being with us this evening. I'd now like to ask Father John Convery again to come back and to give us a closing prayer as we bring this event to a close. But hopefully for all of us, this is just a beginning, and we might revisit this. And please contact me about any of the questions and we'll pass them on. Father John, can I hand over to you, please?
Thank you, Marion. And again, thanks to the conversation and the dialogue we've had this evening. I thought it was great. I just want to end with a very short reflection again from Dr. King, which he said in the 1960s, but maybe just as pertinent even for us today. And he talks about the Jericho road and the image of the Good Samaritan in the gospel. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. We are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day, we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. Compassion sees that an edifice that produces beggars needs restructuring. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. And we end our meeting this evening in the words of Pope Francis from Fratelli Tutti. Come, Holy Spirit, show us your beauty, reflected in all the peoples of the earth, so that we may discover anew that all are important and all are necessary. Different faces of the one humanity that God so loves. And may Almighty God keep us, protect us, and guide us, and give us a restful night. Amen.
Thank you, Father John. Thank you, everybody. And let's take all of this away with us and think about it very thoroughly. Thank you and good night. Thank you.